Ever stood under a sky so wide, your secrets felt small? Here on the World of Cowboy Stories, we ride the stories of the West Campfire, truths trail, dust memories, saloon whispers. Gritty humans, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The heat in Kestrel Flats pressed down like a hand. Noonlight hammered the square until every nail in the auction scaffold showed its rust. Flies swarmed. Men laughed through tobacco smoke. Women held handkerchiefs to their noses and watched anyway. The telegraph line that cut across the sky sang a thin, high whine as the wind worried it, a sound like a warning no one wanted to hear. They brought her out in a plain gray dress, wrists bound with rawhide. A strip of pale blue silk covered her from cheek to chin. Ada Lark did not look up. She set her feet on the planks as if the wood might slip, then folded her hands in front of her and went still. Dust crawled up her hem. The auction caller lifted his hat to scratch his scalp. His voice cracked. "Folks, what you see is God's mercy," he said. "She is quiet, she is useful, and she is in need of a good Christian home." Laughter rolled out from the shade like heat. "Useful," someone called. Another voice asked if she came with a refund. Vera Lou Barrett leaned in her doorway under the tin sign for the Bluefinch Saloon. Her lipstick was the color of a fresh cut. She tipped her glass toward the scaffold. "Buy her a broom," she said, "and she will keep your ghosts company." That got them going again. The noise rose, scattered, rose again. By the courthouse, Harlan Cutter rested one shoulder against a scorched post. He chewed a sliver of toothpick. His vest was too fine for the dust, but he wore it like a dare. The sun flashed in his gold cufflinks. Sheriff Reeves Calder stood a distance away with his hat low, his face unreadable. He watched without moving. The badge at his chest caught a small, dull piece of light and gave it back to the air. The caller slapped the ledger with his palm. "Starting bid? Let us not be shy." Coins clinked for show and fell back into pockets. Ada kept her head bowed. Her breath made the blue silk lift and settle. $1, said a voice near the back. It was quiet for a heartbeat. Heads turned. Cole Bennett stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt boots powdered with red dust. His shirt was sweat dark down the spine. In his palm, he had set a silver coin flat, and the sun clung to it. "Only $1," the caller tried. "Surely a woman's hands are worth more than a stamp in a book." The square waited. No one answered. A fly crawled across the caller's lip, and he did not swipe it. "Sold," he said finally, and hit the plank with the side of his ledger. The laughter rose again, nervous this time. Vera Lou's smile thinned. Cutter did not smile at all. Cole climbed the 3 steps to the scaffold and reached for the rawhide. He did not look at the crowd. The knot fought him and then gave. The rawhide fell to the wood with a soft slap. Ada's wrists were pale under the dirt. He saw the marks the cord had left and said nothing. "Come on," he said low. She hesitated, then stepped down behind him. The crowd split out of habit, then closed again to stare. Deputy Price kicked at a pebble and missed. A little boy pointed and got his hand slapped. No one spoke to her. No one spoke for her. They passed the Bluefinch. Vera Lou blew a slow curl of smoke. "Quiet ones break in easy," she said, but her voice held a burr that had not been there a minute ago. Cole did not look her way. Sheriff Reeves watched them cross the street, then flicked the brim of his hat with one finger and kept his thoughts to himself. Past the livery, past Newton Briggs's general store where coffee beans perfumed the air, past the trough where the water wore a skin of dust. Cole's wagon waited under the telegraph line. The wire sang as the wind shifted. The sound chased along the street and lost itself in the far heat. He held out a hand to help her climb. She looked at it, then at him. Her eyes were a dark brown that gathered light rather than reflecting it. She placed her hand in his small and cool and stepped up. They left the square behind. The road out of town ran like a pale scar between sage and stone. The wheels shuddered over ruts. Grasshoppers leapt and cracked the air with their wings. Cole did not speak. The leather of the reins creaked. Ada held the seat with her fingertips and watched the dust curl from the spokes. "You can take off the scarf if you want," he said after a time. She turned her face not quite toward him. Her hand rose as if to lift the silk, then fell back to her lap. "All right," he said. "When you want." The land opened. Far north, the black teeth of the devil's spine cut the horizon. Clouds gathered beyond it like a bruise. The wind came out of that direction dry and thin. It slid over the wagon boards and under their collars. The telegraph line followed the road a while longer, then bent away and disappeared into the grass. Cole's cabin sat on a low swell of ground half hidden by greasewood and a tilted cottonwood that had surrendered one side to lightning. A line of bottles hung from a cedar frame along the porch, all shapes and colors tied by wire and twine. When the wind moved, the glass spoke in small, clear sounds that did not match the place. It sounded like water without the river. He set the brake. Ada sat a moment and listened. The bottles sang. The door wore a scar of old fire across the grain where the boards had taken a scorch and lived. A piece of cedar leaned by the threshold, blackened on one edge, smoothed by a hand. Cole climbed down and came around. He offered his hand again. She took it. The boards gave under their weight with an honest groan. "I keep the animals over the rise," he said. "Water is in the barrel, wood in the lean-to, kitchen straight through. There is a room on the left. The latch sticks if you do not talk to it." The corner of his mouth twitched. Ada's eyes moved as he spoke. Barrel, lean-to, stove shelf. A small clock lay on the table inside its glass, cracked. The second hand ticked once, then caught and ticked again. Tock, tock, tock. The sound was a heartbeat that had learned to limp. He set a tin cup on the table and poured from a kettle. The air filled with the taste of boiled coffee and iron. "You hungry?" he asked. She lifted a wrist, then folded her hands together and shook her head once. He nodded. He showed her the small room with a bed that had learned the shape of one man. Clean linen waited in a careful stack. He touched the jamb with 2 fingers as they passed, and the wood knew him. "If you need something," he said, "push this door and mine will creak. I will hear it." She looked at him, then at the cup, then at the window where the brown world stared back in. He stepped back. "I will tend the horse," he said. "Take a breath. The air's clean out here." When he was gone, she stood in the doorway of the small room and pressed her fingers to the wall. The wood was warm. She set the blue silk on the table, folded once, then again. Her jaw tightened and her throat worked. No sound came. She reached into the pocket of her dress and drew a slip of paper and a stub of pencil. "Thank you," she wrote in a careful hand, then hesitated and added a second line for not asking. She set it by the cup. Outside, Cole checked the harness and the wheels, then ran his hands down the horse's legs. The sky had gone white at the edges where heat peeled light loose from color. From the porch, the bottle sounded like a choir learning a song. When he stepped back inside, the room held a new shape because of the note. He read it and did not read it aloud. He folded it once, then tucked it in the pocket over his heart where the clock would have been if he wore one. He set a small pan on the stove and cracked 2 eggs. The shells split clean. The yolks held. He slid the plate across the table and did not watch her eat. He studied the crack in the clock glass instead. When he did look up, she had taken 1 egg and left the other. The plate was turned a quarter turn from where he had put it, as if it had revolved of its own mind. "You can have the room," he said. "I will take the other. The roof holds. The wind will sound worse than it is. The bottles help." She nodded. Her hands trembled once, then went quiet. She picked up the blue silk and held it, not yet tying it back. The first evening laid itself down slow. The heat broke. A long shadow from the cottonwood slid its black hand over the porch. Cole sat on the top step and rolled a small stone between thumb and forefinger. He listened to the distance. The cabin settled. Boards spoke to nails. Nails held. He did not look back when he heard her move. She stepped out with the scarf in her hand. The air carried sage and the sour memory of horses. She stood at the edge of the porch, eyes on the north. A hawk crossed the sky without beating its wings. Cole followed her gaze. Devil's Spine sat on the horizon like a broken jaw. For a breath, a dull red winked along one ridge here and gone. Not a flame, not lightning, only a pulse that made the eyes doubt themselves. Ada lifted her chin, and the blue silk lifted with it a small flag of color in a land that did not wear color often. The telegraph wire far down the road tightened and sang. The bottles answered with a clear note that made the porch boards hum under their boots. Night did not rush. It took the heat out of the square a handful at a time and put the light where it wanted it. Ada stood until her fingers loosened on the scarf. Cole watched until the last brightness slid off the spine and left the ridge a line of teeth against a deepening sky. The wind shifted. The bottles changed key. Somewhere in the dry grass, a cricket started up, then another. Ada exhaled a sound too soft to name. The scarf slid through her hands and pooled on the rail. Far off on the north line, something glimmered and went dark. By full dark, the ridge had gone to black glass. The bottles on the porch kept a soft, patient music, thin notes that did not travel far. Cole lit the lamp low and showed Ada how the latch stuck on the bedroom door. The hinge protested. She pressed her thumb to the pin, set her ear to the metal, and turned the bar with a steady hand. The latch slid clean. She gave him a small nod, almost a bow. He slept in the other room with his boots under the bed and a blanket at his feet. The clock on the table in the main room ticked like a horse with a stone in its shoe. It did not stop. Out in the night a coyote called and then let the silence cover it again. Morning came with a white edge. Wind slid over the flats and gathered on the porch rail. The bottles made a new sound in that hour, less bright, more throat than glass. Cole rose to feed the horse and check the fence line. When he came back, the stove was warm and the pot on it hissed. On the table, a small folded paper waited by his tin cup. Thank you. Under it, a second line thinner. The wind sounds kinder here. He sat. Steam rose and cleared his head. He wrote on the back of an old receipt and left the words by her place. It does with company. She found the note, read it twice, and tucked it in the pocket of her dress. They ate in quiet eggs and a heel of bread. The scrape of forks on tin sounded too loud at first, then settled in with the clock and the small song of the bottles. When she stood to wash the plates, the kitchen door gave its old groan. She moved her shoulder, listened, then pulled a tin of tallow from a shelf and worked it into the hinge with a strip of rag. The next time the door opened, it did it like a secret. After breakfast, Cole hitched the wagon. He needed coffee flour, a coil of wire. Ada waited on the porch with her scarf in her lap. The breeze brought the smell of dust and pinon smoke from the town. The telegraph line along the road caught the light and sang a thin silver note. She watched it. At Newton Briggs's store, the bell over the door made a tired sound. Coffee beans sat in sacks like brown rivers. Newton leaned on the counter with the smug look of a man who owned sugar in a dry week. He made a show of counting nails into a paper twist. Got yourself a quiet household now, Bennett. Less argument that way. He laughed at his own wit. Cole set coins on the counter and said, needles, thread, and a new file. The needles went into the bag. Newton tried another smile, then let him go. On the boardwalk outside, Harlan Cutter stood with a hat that had never seen work. He tapped the edge of a folded paper on his thigh. The courthouse door behind him hung crooked. He looked Cole over as if buying a horse. You step careful out there by the spine. Land gets confusing. Ownership, too. Sheriff Reeves watched from the corner of his eye where he stood by the water trough. He did not move. He did not blink. Cole did not answer the man. He bent to check the wagon pin and said to Reeves' breeze coming out of the north. Sheriff tipped the brim of his hat in a slow circle. Smells like a storm that forgot its rain. Ada did not go with him into Briggs's. She walked to the creek that slid past the edge of town with more sand than water in it. Women laid shirts on smooth rocks and talked about prices as if talk could hold them in place. One woman, younger than Ada and already tired in the eyes, looked up and smiled. June Alvarez, she said, as if it was a greeting. The baby on her hip chewed the edge of a cloth and made wet sounds. Ada nodded and passed her a bucket. June poured and warmed her hands over the spill. No questions, no pity. That was the whole conversation. When Ada left, she set a small square of paper on the rock. You are kind. June read it with her mouth pressed tight, then lifted the paper to her chest as if it could warm her. On the way back, a small boy with dust in his hair mimed the way Ada walked slow and careful. Another child threw a pebble that hit the ground in front of her and jumped sideways like a fish. The pebble was a dare. Ada looked at it, then kept her eyes level with the road and walked on. The boys laughed louder. Cole came out of Briggs' store with his bag and a roll of wire. He put himself between them and Ada without lifting his hands. That is enough. He did not raise his voice. The boys felt the weight of a man who had used silence like a blade. They slunk away. Cole did not turn to watch them go. They reached the cabin by noon. The wind settled for a while as if it had found a low place to sleep. Ada moved through the rooms and learned them by touch. She set a sprig of sage on the window sash. She took a length of paracord and tied the bottle strings in a new order so the pitch of the notes rose and fell like breath instead of shake and clatter. Cole watched from the step. "You play them," he said. She tilted her head. He tapped his chest. "I hear it." The second day, June Alvarez came with eyes like raw glass and a child hot against her neck. She did not bother with words on the path. She pushed the door open with a hip and laid loose on the bed. The baby's skin shone with heat. Ada put her palm to the small forehead and then to her own cheek. She worked without discussion. Cole drew water from the barrel and set it in bowls. Ada stripped the child to a diaper-dipped cloths and laid them over the small chest and crown. She hummed a tune too simple to be a song. It sounded like the wind caught in the bottles when the air was gentle. June stood with her hands half closed. "Please," she said without shape to the words. Ada glanced up, met her eyes, and nodded once. The nod had the weight June needed. Hours slid by in the slow way that fever hours go. The room smelled of wet linen and smoke from the stove. The clock stuttered on. The baby's breath hitched and then leveled hitch and then level until the hitch was gone. Ada lifted the cloth to wring it, and her hands shook for the first time that day. June cried as if someone had finally told her a truth she could stand to hear. She pressed her face to the child's feet and let the tears drop there as if they could cool them. Ada wrote on the back of a calendar page, "She will live." Then she added, "She saved me too." Cole sat in the doorway and watched the sky turn the color of old copper. He did not speak. He did not move. June wrapped loose and kissed Ada's hand and left without finding a word for that act. Later the wind came up hard. It hit the porch and a wall. The bottle tree rang bright and then brighter, a scatter of notes that turned sharp. Cole went out to bring in the saddle and the coil of rawhide. That was when the smell reached him. Not the stove, not the dust. A sting in the throat that climbed into the head. He turned and saw the smear of orange behind the rise. The barn. He ran. Ada was already moving with a bucket in each hand. Fire ran along the eaves like a thing alive and eager. The horses screamed against their halters and kicked at stallboards. Heat lifted the hair on Cole's arms. Smoke hit his lungs like a fist. He cut rope, slammed gates, and slapped a flank that would not move. Ada threw water where the flames licked at straw. Sparks fell into her sleeves and flared. She shoved her forearms into the trough and came up dripping. Her scarf caught a coal and smoked. She tore it free and threw it down where the mud could take it. A wind change pushed the fire back into itself. The roof creaked in a way that told of beams that had not yet lost their voice. Cole drove the last horse out into the yard. The animal bolted and then spun in a circle, blind with fear. Ada spoke to it without sound, her hands wide and low. The horse took that shape and stilled. Rain gathered from a sky that had looked empty a minute before. It came in fat drops that hit the dust and made it spit. The flames sulked and then gave up ground. Smoke climbed and thinned. When the rain quit, the barn stood in a black skeleton. The smell of it settled into hair and cloth and did not leave. Cole stood with his hands on his knees and his breath in pieces. He tasted iron. Ada walked to the edge of the wreck and knelt in the wet ash. She pressed one finger into the mud and pulled it through. The word formed clean under her hand. "Stay." She left the word there and stood. Cole read it. He read it again. He did not try to fasten meaning to it. He wiped his face on the back of his wrist and looked at her. She did not flinch from his gaze. Rain still shone on her cheeks in small beads that did not fall. He wanted to speak, but the air had a new sound in it, not bottles, not the low sigh of wet grass. From the slope beyond the corral, a single hoof knocked stone, then another. A rifle was worked somewhere in the dark, a small clean click that separated itself from every other sound the night had to offer. The telegraph line far down the road tightened and let go and sent a thin cry into the empty miles. The word in the mud held its shape. The wind turned and came off the spine. The scent of smoke rose again as if also listening. The night listened back. The horse on the slope stamped once more. Metal slid against metal in a careful hand. Cole set his palm on Ada's arm without looking at her and moved toward the corner of the corral where shadow pooled. The smell of wet ash from the barn mixed with the bitter edge of oil. A shot cracked. The sound jumped off the hill and came down on them twice. Dirt spat from the post by Cole's head. He dropped to a knee and made himself flat in the trough's shade. Another report answered from higher ground. He felt heat at his shoulder and then a cold that ran to the fingers. He did not swear. He put one breath in front of the next and pulled his revolver free. Ada was there on the other side of the trough with a bucket not hiding, waiting for his eyes. He jerked his chin toward the ridge. She understood. The next shot tore a strip from his sleeve and spun him soft against the boards. He fired once. A voice on the hill coughed and fell silent. The other rifleman worked his bolt in a hurry and lost the slick calm of the first few shots. Hooves scraped rock, then fled. Ada slid her hands under Cole's chest and pulled. She was not strong in the way that lifts logs. She was strong in the way that moves what must be moved. The porch boards took his weight. The bottles hit a hard note and then went back to their slow song. Blood ran warm along his upper arm and soaked into his shirt. He pressed his palm there and felt the slick. Inside the lamp lived. Ada brought it close and looked at the wound and at his face and at the wound again. She set water to heat, then tore strips from a linen sheet. The scarf lay on the table from where she had thrown it earlier. She did not reach for it. She unrolled a bandage with steady fingers and then caught the tremor that wanted to start and set it down. He tried to sit. She put her hand on his chest, and he stayed. He let his head turn on the board and watched the flame of the lamp lean toward a seam in the window. The clock on the table ticked, and then stuttered, and then found its tick again. Ada cut his sleeve. The knife made a small sound like breath leaving. The bullet had gone through the meat above the biceps and lodged in the beam behind him. She cleaned the edges with cool water and pressed a cloth there. He watched her face as she worked. The blue silk was gone. In the light, he saw the thin white line that traveled from the hinge of her jaw toward the hollow at her throat, like a river on a map. She did not hide it from him. She did not explain it. The pain came up, then leveled, then settled in as something he could call by a name. She looped the bandage and tied it with a knot that put the pressure exactly where it belonged. He let out air. She soaked another cloth and touched it to his forehead as if heat could be talked down like a skittish horse. He found his voice out of habit. "You found me?" The words were a dry rasp that did not carry. Ada looked at him and shook her head once. The look said there was nowhere else to find. She brought the lamp lower and wrote on the back of a receipt with his pencil, "You are safe." She set the words where he could see them without lifting his head. The sky went gray at the edges of the window. Wind ran fingers through the grass that had looked dead all summer and made it show life. Cole slept without knowing where sleep began. When he woke again, the world had moved 1 hour farther, and the room had gotten smaller around the bed. Boots on the porch. A knock with a knuckle that did not insist. Sheriff Reeves came in with his hat in his hands and a look that weighed without taking. He saw the bandage, the bloody shirt, the trail in the dust where Ada had pulled. He set the hat on a chair and went to the door again to look at the yard. "Found sign on the rise," he said. 2 riders, one bleeding, one scared of it. The bleeding one turned north. The scared one turned where the ground does not tell you the truth. He came back to the table and put a roll of paper there that uncoiled on its own. It was a surveyor's plan for the Devil's Spine lode, older than Cole and older than Ada's scar. Grease and thumbprints had polished its corners. Reeves touched a spot with one finger. Here is where the timbers were meant to double. Here is where they did not. He tapped another mark faint in a hand that tried to look official and failed. Order 2 more beams, it read, and then in another pen later lower it said push through. The sheriff let his finger rest there until the paper remembered the warmth. He did not say the name. He did not have to. Ada stepped closer. Her mouth opened without sound. She reached for a bit of coal from the stove box and wrote on the table itself in dark lines that would not wipe off. "They said it fell because I screamed." The room held the line like it was a guest. Reeves read the words and set his hands at his sides. He was a man who had learned how to keep different silences for different kinds of pain. He looked at Cole. Cole looked at Ada. He said the only thing he had that fit. No one touches that hole. Ada stood with the coal in her fingers and her eyes on the paper. She nodded once very small, as if that nod might knock something gentle loose inside her ribs. Reeves rolled the map tight and slid the rawhide thong around it. He worked the knot until it gave, then tied it fresh. He picked up his hat and paused. "I was in town late," he said, voice made of something plain. Saw a light in the clerk's office. Heard ink scratch. Warfield does not scratch for free. He did not ask for permission. He did not make a threat. He put his hat on, and the morning took the shape of him and let him out the door. When he was gone, the cabin felt bigger. Cole sat slow and eased his back against the wall. Ada swept the coal dust off the table with her palm, and then stopped and left the words there. She went to the door and watched the line where the porch meets the yard. A hawk rode an empty circle above the flats, and the shadow of it ran along the ground with the shape of a question. Cole closed his eyes and listened for the bottles. They were quiet. The wind had a different job. He let the clock tell him time he did not need. The second hand stumbled. It caught. It moved. In Kestrel Flats, the courthouse held its lean against the morning. Inside, Stanley Warfield sat with his vest tight and his throat loose. Harlan Cutter leaned over his desk with one finger pressed to a paper that smelled of whiskey and heat. The finger wore a ring that had not been earned at a forge. The ink where the name should go waited. Warfield took the pen and let it do what the ring asked. The pen scratched. A bead of black thickened and fell from the nib to the desk and made a mark that did not mean anything to the document, but would mean something to a man with eyes. Cutter rested a leather wallet on the open page without putting it down. Warfield licked his lips and let the wallet stay. Outside the window, the telegraph wire made a single hard whine as if to say it had heard and would remember. Back at the cabin, Ada brought cold water with willow bark steeped until the taste went bitter and right. He drank and set the cup down and watched her fingers move. She gathered the bottles on the porch and retied them in the order she had chosen the day before. This time she left one clear bottle without a string and placed it on the rail. The wind found the others and made music. The single bottle caught light and did nothing. The quiet it held was the shape of a thought. June Alvarez came up the path with Luce asleep against her shoulder and circles under her eyes that looked better than the day before. She stood at the step and pressed her hand to her heart for Ada and then for Cole. No words. He lifted his chin in a way that meant more than his mouth could make right now. June set a small loaf of bread on the rail and backed away so as not to bruise the piece that had been built there. Noon pushed the cool out of the air. Heat shivered the plain. Sheriff Reeves rode back dust on his cuffs, and something sharpened in his eyes. He tied his horse to the post and came up slow. He stood without sitting and let his look circle the yard, as if it might point at the thing he meant. "You should know," he said finally, "that Cutter is not trying to be clever anymore. He is trying to be loud. He has men with him. He has paper from a hand that never owned a fence post and never will." Reeves took the brim of his hat and squared it, then set it down on his head. Folks are gathering without knowing if they came to see or to help. He waited to see if those words would land. Cole stood. Pain pulled at the edge of his sight and then eased. He went to the doorframe and set his palm on the burn scar there out of habit. Ada stood beside the porch rail with her scarf loose in her fingers. The color of it cooled the air just enough to breathe. Reeves let the silence complete the thought. He stepped off the porch and checked the cinch on his sorrel. He looked toward town and then toward the spine. He mounted and turned the horse to the yard again, to them and to the bottle tree that answered as the wind came in. He touched the brim the way a man does when leaving a place he means to return to. The sun pulled itself higher. A thin cloud crossed it and failed to dim it. The telegraph line picked up a small run of chatter that came and went so fast you had to decide if you had heard anything. In the roadbed beyond the cottonwood, A faint ribbon of dust lifted and lay down and lifted again. The word on the table inside the cabin held its place. The clock ticked. The bottle without a string snared a point of light and kept it. The porch boards took the weight of two people standing side by side and did not complain. By mid-afternoon the light went white and hard. Heat rose from the flats and turned the air to a shimmer. The ribbon of dust on the road thickened and held. Hooves beat a steady count that grew teeth as it neared the yard. Cole and Ada stood on the porch. The bottle tree spoke in thin, bright notes that did not carry. Sheriff Reeves rode in slow and took his place in the middle of the yard with both boots planted. He rested one hand near his holster and let the other hang loose. Harlan Cutter came first. He sat a glossy bay and looked pleased with his own shadow. Behind him stretched 24 men with rifles across their saddles. Their hats made a dark line against the sky. The telegraph wire far off sang a high warning that did not move any horse. Cutter reined up and smiled so the gold in his teeth could show. Afternoon Bennett. Fine day for paperwork. He pulled a folded deed from inside his vest and shook it once as if it needed air. County says this ground and what lies under it belong to me. The paper flashed. The ink shone wet where it had dried too fast. Reeves did not take the paper. He kept his boots in the dirt and his voice level. You step one hoof past where you stand, and I will call it theft. He looked at the men behind Cutter and not at Cutter. A few of them shifted in their saddles. Dust crawled up their pant legs and clung there. Cutter laughed. Law is the hand that signs sheriff, and the hand is signed. He let his bay turn half a circle, showing off his numbers. The men watched the porch where Ada stood, scarf in her fingers, and where Cole had set his shoulder against the post. People from Kestrel Flats lined the road behind the riders. Vera Lou left the shade of the blue finch and stood with her arms folded, face drawn thin. Newton Briggs drifted to the back of the crowd and hid behind a taller man. June Alvarez held loose against her chest and bounced the child without moving her feet. Mick Donnelly stood near the front and could not keep his hands still. Cutter turned his horse to face the porch. He let his smile drop. You bought yourself a hushed house, Bennett. You think that means the land will hush, too. He let his eyes slide to Ada and then back as if she were weather. Cole stepped down from the porch. He did it slow so the pain would not show in his walk. He set himself beside Reeves. You burned my barn, he said. You sent men with rifles. His voice did not rise. The words sat in the yard like stakes in hard ground. Cutter gave a small shrug. Accidents collect themselves during dry weather. He lifted the deed higher. The law is simple. The paper says mine. He extended it toward Reeves as if the sheriff would be grateful to hold it. Reeves looked at the paper and then at Cutter and did not move. The law will read that after it reads the clerk. You want to wait while I go fetch him Harlan. Those watching heard the shape inside the words. Cutter's mouth twitched. His horse tossed its head and worked the bit. He looked past the sheriff to Ada. Voice of a ghost, he called. Come on then, curse me. The men behind him laughed because they thought that was what they had come for. Ada stood very still. The wind lifted the blue silk in her hand, then let it fall. Her jaw clenched and unclenched once. She stepped off the porch. The yard took her weight and did not complain. She walked until she stood a few feet behind Reeves and to one side where Cutter could see her, and so could the men stacked on the road. She spoke. The sound came out rough and small and real. No, she swallowed. Then in pieces that held together by will, she said, You knew the timbers were weak. You told them to push through. My father, my mother, my brothers. In there. The yard lost its noise. The horses made sound and then stopped. The telegraph line went to a thin hush. A man near the back spat and then looked at his own boot, as if it had done the spitting without permission. Cutter's smile came back crooked. She is touched, he said. She does not know what she says. Mad women tell stories. He tried to speak to the crowd and not to Ada, but his eyes kept finding her, then slipping away. Mick Donnelly stepped forward until he stood where the riders could see him clearly. He held his hat in both hands as if he had already been to church and had lost his place there. He did not look at Ada. He looked at Reeves and then at Cutter. That night in the spine, he said, voice dry, "You said there was silver under the fault. You said to keep going. I heard you." He swallowed and his throat worked hard. "We all heard you." One of Cutter's men shifted his rifle, so it was not quite so ready. Another man looked down the road toward town as if he had left something on the stove. Cutter's face went tight. "You cannot prove a memory," he told Reeves, but the words fell in front of him instead of reaching anyone. Cole took one step so that he stood half a shoulder ahead of Reeves. "You buried her once," he said. "You do not get to do it again." Cutter's hand went for his gun. It moved fast in a way that had pleased him before. Cole saw it and moved because there was nothing else to do. The shot broke the heat. It cracked the yard in two. The sound rolled up the cottonwood and split in its branches. Pain hit Cole like a door. He felt the punch in his other shoulder, and his legs went light. He saw Ada's mouth shape his name, and he did not hear it, but he knew it. Reeves drew and fired in one motion. The report came like a judge. Cutter's pistol spun out of his hand and hit the dirt. The bay danced sideways. Reeves stepped in and grabbed Cutter's bridle and yanked the horse down to its front feet. He had Cutter by the wrist in the next breath and had him on the ground in the one after that. Dust rose in a brown sheet and then fell back. Reeves bound the hands he had been looking at since he rode in. Cutter's men looked at one another and found no order among themselves. A few turned their horses without a word and left at a lope that pretended it was not a run. The rest backed away from the porch and the sheriff and the tied man on the ground and let the crowd from town fill the space they left. Ada was already at Cole's side. She went to her knees and pressed both hands to the wet on his shirt. Blood pushed between her fingers and warmed her skin. Cole looked up at her with eyes trying to find the edge of the world and put it back where it belonged. She bent close. "Stay," she said, and the word had the same shape it had held in mud, but this time it carried breath. He held on to her wrist. His palm left a print there. She did not wipe it away. Reeves stood over Cutter and did not put his knee in the man's back because he did not need to. He raised his head and addressed the yard. "You saw." His voice reached the men on horses, and the women at the split rail, and the plain beyond. Vera Lou let out a breath she had been holding for months. June shifted Luss higher and kissed the top of the sleeping head. Mick Donnelly looked at Ada then. He did not try to speak. He put his hat on, then took it off again, then held it to his chest. Newton Briggs stared at his own boots. The crowd folded its voices away and found the use of quiet. Ada kept pressure on the wound. Cole's blood ran slower under her palms. He blinked and found her eyes and then found them again. The bottles on the porch moved in a new breeze and made a sound that had been missing from the yard since the riders came. The telegraph line sang a single clear note and went still. Reeves pulled Cutter to his feet and walked him out to the road with his hands tied. He did not speak to him. He spoke to the men who had not yet turned their horses. "You can go home, or you can follow me. The choice is the same kind of choice in daylight as it is at night." The men looked at their reins and then chose. Vera Lou came up the path and stopped short of the porch. Her hands looked wrong without a glass in them. She tried to meet Ada's eyes, failed, tried again. Her mouth opened and closed, then stayed closed. She stood guard instead, facing the road sharp as a new nail. June stepped forward and crouched near Ada and Cole. She touched Ada's shoulder with 3 fingers and left them there light as breath. Ada did not look up. She would not break the line between her hands and the blood that was stopping. Cole's face eased a shade. His lashes trembled and then stilled. The heat pulled back a little as if a cloud had bothered to move. The smell of smoke from the burned barn rose at the edge of the yard and softened. Reeves and his prisoner and the riders moved toward town in a loose string. The crowd followed without speaking. Dust lifted behind them and hung in the air like fabric. On the porch rail, Ada's blue scarf lay where she had dropped it, a strip of sky in a yard that had seen too much ground. She took it up and pressed it to Cole's shoulder. It took his blood and held it. The bottle tree sang once clear and sweet. Inside the cabin, the clock ticked, caught, and ticked again. The house breathed. The land held the sound. Morning came cleaner than it deserved. A thin wash of rain had moved through before light enough to press the dust down and leave dark freckles on the steps. The bottle tree spoke in a low voice, bright notes softened by damp. Inside, Ada changed the bandage on Cole's shoulder. Her touch was careful. The skin around the wound was angry red, but the heat had fallen. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Only when I breathe," he said, and his mouth found a small curve that had been missing for a while. "Then breathe easy," she said, and the words held. In Kestrel Flats, Sheriff Reeves tacked a paper to the board by the jail, and then another to the courthouse door that still hung crooked. The nails went in straight. The notices said the Lark family was cleared of blame in the Devil's Spine collapse, that Harlan Cutter was held for assault and fraud, that further claims against the mine would be settled for the families that had lost names to the earth. Reeves stood with his hands at his sides and let the town read. The telegraph line above the street gave one long humming note and then went quiet as if it had listened enough. Men who had laughed 2 days ago kept their hats in their hands. Vera Lou came to the edge of the board and stood until her lipstick looked like it belonged to a different woman. Newton Briggs tried to look like a man who had always liked the truth. Mick Donnelly read with his jaw set, then signed his name where Reeves asked him to sign the black of the ink darker than the shade under the awning. At the cabin, June, Alvarez walked the path with Luce asleep and a loaf wrapped in a dish towel. She paused at the porch rail and lifted the bread with 2 hands as if it weighed more than flour and water. Ada met her at the step. June did not try to speak first. Ada touched Luce's foot with 1 finger, then looked up. "Thank you," Ada said the words, soft and complete. June nodded and let out air she had been keeping. Around noon, Vera Lou climbed the rise with her hat in one hand and her breath in need of catching. She held a bunch of small yellow flowers tied with string. They looked like scraps of sun caught on stems. She stopped at the edge of the porch and faced Ada. "I brought these," she said. Her voice did not know what to do with itself. "I was not kind." Ada took the flowers and set them on the rail where the bottles could see them. "Next time be kind," she said. Vera swallowed and blinked hard once. "Reckon I will." She stood guard for a minute with her back to the road, then lifted her hand without turning and walked down the path. Cole sat in the doorway with his feet on the step and his shoulder wrapped clean. He watched Vera go and then watched Ada tie the stems with a piece of blue silk. She had washed the scarf, and now it carried only the faint smell of soap and rain. She teased one narrow strip free, looped it through a clear bottle's wire, and tied a square knot the way she had tied the bandage. The bottle caught the color and let it go a little at a time. When the wind found it, the note that came off the bottle was warmer than before. Mick Donnelly appeared in the heat of the afternoon with a hammer on his belt and a coil of wire over one shoulder. He had not been asked. He tipped his hat and went to the corral that had taken flame. He replaced shattered boards, set new nails, tightened a hinge that had lost its patience. When he was done, he stood by the gate with his hat in his hands. He did not look up. "Thank you," Cole said from the step. Mick gave one short nod and walked toward town with the quiet of a man who had done a thing that needed doing. Sheriff Reeves came late in the day. He left his horse at the cottonwood where the bark still showed Lightning's hand. He took the porch steps slow and stood where the shade made a square on the floorboards. "Cutter is on his way to the county seat," he said. "Warfield will answer questions with the door closed and a federal man at the table. The mine will not open for men who forget names." He let his eyes pass over the doorway. The bottle tree, the word on the table inside where Cole had once been dragged across the wood. He tapped the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. "Quiet suits this place," he said. He did not stay long. He left the shape of calm behind him. The rain returned at dusk, a soft curtain that moved across the flats and left the air smelling like metal and green. By morning, the ground had made a new skin. Tiny blooms pushed up through the crust in colors the land had been hiding. Pinks no one had a word for, yellows that matched Vera's flowers, a blue that remembered Ada's scarf. Cole stood at the edge of the porch and laughed under his breath. "Did not know the desert had a dress," he said. "It was there," Ada answered. "It only needed water." The clock on the table had been born wrong. The second hand jumped and sulked. That morning, after the rain, it found a rhythm and kept it. Talk, then talk again, then the same talk once more without a stumble. Cole picked it up, listened, and set it down where it had always lived. He did not mention it. Ada heard it anyway. He cut 2 cords and a plank from a cedar that had fallen long ago and made a swing under the porch eave. The hammering woke a small echo in the yard. He set the plank level and tested the knots with both hands. "Try it," he said. Ada lowered herself until the wood took her weight. The ropes creaked. The swing moved an inch, then 2, then more. A laugh came out of her, surprised and bright a sound with edges that fit the air. Cole leaned on the rail and watched the color come to her face and thought of rain on dust. Evening made the flats into pieces of shadow and copper. June brought coffee. Vera brought sugar and left it without a word. Newton Briggs walked up with a sack and set it on the steps and went away before anyone could see him do it. Reeves rode by at the edge of the yard and lifted a hand. Luce toddled on the packed dirt and chased a moth that was not worried about being caught. Ada spoke more. Not much, enough to place a word where it could do its work. She said Cole's name once when he was at the fence, and he turned at exactly the right time. He said her name, and it sat in the air like a round stone, simple and whole. When the wind shifted out of the north, the bottle tree answered with a chord that felt like a house learning a song. Night found them on the swing. The porch boards held steady under their boots. The scarf on the bottle lifted and fell. The telegraph line along the road stayed quiet and silver against the last light. Devil's Spine lay on the horizon, black and harmless. The smell of wet sage came soft. Crickets learned the same beat and kept it. Ada leaned her head on Cole's shoulder and felt his breath move sure and slow. The clock inside kept time that did not need watching. They did not speak for a long while. They shared the space between sounds and did not try to name it. Ada looked at the blue of the scarf, and at the clear bottle it touched, and at the shape of the note it made when the wind found it. She closed her eyes, and the music kept going. Cole reached and set his hand over hers on the rope. The swing gave one small sigh and settled into a rhythm that matched the clock and the quiet and the land that had finally decided to rest. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.